All right, so it looks like the Federal Reserve is getting ready to crank up the money printer. As you can see on this image here, the 10-year Treasury is starting to finally crack that 4% threshold and start to get into the very high threes, which ultimately means that the 10-year Treasury is experiencing an increasing rise in demand, which ultimately lowers the yields over time, i.e., Federal Reserve starting to buy more of these treasuries. And as it's also been announced, that the Federal Reserve will proceed to end quantitative tightening and lean into quantitative easing, starting on December 1st. In other words, we've basically just kind of, in my opinion, cried uncle on trying to get inflation any lower per se. And I think it's now just pretty much understood that, hey, getting things back to that 2% target probably not going to happen, even though we say it's a goal. Realistically, 3% is going to become the 2% because the reality is every time we try to grow our economy by printing more money, our economy then adjusts to that new money. And then when we try to retract that money out of the system, it tends to bring everything else down with it, right? And even though on a technical term is probably healthy, the reality is it often turns into lost jobs, stalling wages, and stuff like that. And obviously, that's not politically feasible. And so it is what it is, right? But anyway, I guess one pro would be is that this ultimately will also help lower mortgage rates over time because they're typically created on a spread based off of the 10-year Treasury. But again, that's also going to take time too. Wouldn't be surprised if the Fed starts to, start buying up mortgage-backed securities as well, which ultimately will, lower those rates over time as well, those mortgage rates. So again, right, the play, in my opinion, is just owning assets. It's quite interesting when you start to see the same kind of news popping up in the market over and over. And it just really gives you a good insight into just kind of how people think, right? And how much they rather just kind of keep the good times rolling, and there just comes a point, right, where you as an investor just kind of have to realize, hey, look, I can only do so much as an individual, and it's better to just keep owning assets, growing your assets, and just getting the returns you can so you can just stay one step ahead of, this ongoing inflation over time. So let's see what next week has in store. Peace.